Okay, folks, we have begun our class. This is PR, and I'm with my PhD batch today, and we will be discussing Vladimir Propp's Morphology of the Folktale. Propp is one of the several structuralists that we will be looking at in our syllabus. As you know, our syllabus comprises of Shklovsky, Propp, Levi-Strauss, Saussure, of course, as well as Roland Barthes' mythologies, of which you have only the first essay. So what I will be doing is I'll be sending you an email today. Yesterday night, my internet was giving some problems. So today I'll send you an email with comprehensive resources, everything that you need in order to revise for this, all right? And the other section of the syllabus, which I was handling, is post-colonialism. Unfortunately, we have limited time, so we will only be doing Said and Bhabha in any detail. So Said I've already covered quite thoroughly. You have the introduction to Orientalism very much in your syllabus, so make sure you've read that. As for Bhabha, I'll be taking a long class on Science Taken for Wonders, and it's also, Bhabha has been discussed by Shorab. So Shorab, please share your PPT with your classmates, okay? And if we have time, if we have some time, then I might do one kind of overview class where I talk for 15 or 20 minutes on a few other important figures, such as, for instance, Franz Fanon or Gayatri Spivak. I might briefly talk about them, okay, if we have the time. So that's how things stand. Yes, go ahead, Gina.
So we have only the introduction to Edward Said's Orientalism and not the full text.
No, I've taught the full text in my lecture. I've addressed the key issues that he raises. Now, if you want to read the full text, go ahead. But as part of the prescribed syllabus, I'm setting only the introduction. So you might get, for instance, a direct question. I might take a sentence out of the introduction and ask you to sort of expand on that. So, oi part ta khub thoroughly jante hobe. Of course, I encourage you to read the whole book. Okay.
Okay.
Now, so we are going to start today actually by looking at Vladimir Propp. Again, biographical details not particularly important, but just to give you some kind of information, he was born in St. Petersburg into a Russian family of German descent, and he attended St. Petersburg University, majoring in philology, Russian and German philology. And upon graduation, he taught Russian and Germany, and later became a college teacher of German. And the work of his that we will be looking at, very important work, is called The Morphology of the Folktale, which was published in 1928. And it was a major breakthrough in both folklore studies and morphology, okay? So what does Propp do? I have a PPT, by the way. Let me just do a screen share and share my PPT with you. I'll send the PPT as well, so don't worry. Okay, so you should be seeing my PPT now. Dekhte pacchi sheta? Is this?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so Vladimir Propp. So Propp essentially is drawing on ideas that had already been formulated a little bit in formalist criticism, and he uses the methods of formalist criticism to analyze folktales. All right, his primary materials that he looks at are Russian folktales. And what he does in Morphology of a Folktale is to come up with a kind of typology, which is a classification according to general type of narrative structures, okay? Structures that underlie narratives, and this would go on to be instrumental in establishing a structuralist theory of narrative. Now, what does Propp do? Propp's concern is not with characters, for instance, but with norms, with the rules and norms by which narratives seem to work. Okay, so he's focusing on the units of content in which they seem to deal, and his attempt in the morphology is to present a kind of taxonomy, a scheme of classification of these contents. Okay, so I'll just give you a kind of simple breakup of this. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so Propp's Morphology of the Folktale, then basically what he says is that Russian folktales can be divided into two things. One is spheres of action. This is basically character types or roles. Don't confuse this with individual characters. These are particular roles that characters play. So, for instance, the hero, the villain, you might consider these the dramatis personae or the actors in the story. And then you have 31 functions or actions, also called narratemes. Uh, okay, narratemes are basic units of narrative. So the hero leaves home, or the hero receives aid. So these are very basic structures of the narrative. Okay, so it's comprised, a folktale is comprised of spheres of action, that is roles or characters who are performing certain functions. Okay, so as you can see, Vladimir Propp's Morphology of the Folktale boldly reduced all folktales to 7 spheres of action and 31 fixed elements or functions. And any individual folktale merely combined these spheres of action, which are essentially roles, such as the hero, the helper, the villain, the person sought for, and so on, in specific ways. Okay. Now, one thing to note is that this is quite distinct from what we tend to do, or what was popular at that point in literary studies, because Propp is taking the emphasis away from characters, treating them not as personalities but rather as functions. Okay, so his focus is more on plot than character. So, in the fairy tale, he would suggest, in the fairy tale or folk tale, the all important and unifying element is the character's function, that is, the part that they play in the plot. And the individual qualities of the characters and their personalities are irrelevant to Propp. At his level of abstraction, only their acts, which derive from their functions basically, really count. So the villain and the helper, for instance, are unimportant except for what they do, and what they do always has the same function in various tales. ठीक है? So they might have different names. You might have sort of manifest details at the surface level which differ from tale to tale, but their function will be the same. So the villain will have a particular function. He may have a different name in different stories. The helper will have a different name, but the function in the narrative is the same. So he's taking attention away from the surface differences, as well as from looking at characters in terms of personality, and focusing instead on plot. Now, as I mentioned, one of the things we have to consider, and later on in this lecture, I'll be looking at the limitations of Propp's approach. But one of this is, what are the implications of Propp's method for literary analysis? Because it's quite different, I would say, from what we tend to do in literary studies. Although we don't tend to focus on, characters anymore. At a school level, on a koto are, of course, this is a much older tradition of treating characters as if they were human beings, doing character sketches. So that has fallen out of favor. But nonetheless, we don't neglect personalities of characters. In fact, there are certain schools of analysis where we almost treat them as real human beings. So for instance, in psychoanalytical studies, it is something that you can do to sort of put Hamlet on the couch, so to speak, to treat him almost as a real character. So in literary studies, then we tend to approach characters in a slightly different way. So the applicability of Propp's method to what we are doing is something that is a moot point, and something that we can discuss by and by. Okay. So according to Propp, then Russian folktales are made up of specific narrative functions. These narrative functions include things like leaving home, confronting danger at the hands of a villain, combat between the hero and the villain. Incidentally, there's a lot of background noise. Can you guys just check একটু তোমাদের sound if you can reduce, or if you could? I'm hearing a lot of one thing I'll just pause my share for a minute and return to the menu. কারণ খুব আওয়াজ হচ্ছে, আমি একটু মিউট করছি, ঠিক আছে তোমাদের? I'm just muting you for about 5 minutes. If you have any questions, you have the option of unmuting yourself. All right, you'll see there's an unmute option. So if you need to ask anything, you can unmute yourself, but just so that I'm audible, because this will be recorded for your revision purposes. So ekটু mute করছি. Okay, now I've muted you. If you have any questions, just sort of unmute yourself and raise your issues. Okay, I'll go back to screen sharing. Hold on. Okay, and we're back. Resume slideshow. Okay, so According to Propp, the Russian folktales are made up of specific narrative functions, such as leaving the home, confronting danger, combat between hero and villain, and so on. And the function or the actions are understood as acts of characters, actions that a character can take. Basically, acts or events that are crucial in helping the story along. Now, again, this is something to consider. To what extent is such an action or plot-oriented analysis relevant to or useful for literary studies? Can you think of one reason why? Again, I'm going to unmute you for to ask you this question. Is there? I'm unmuting. Can you think of one reason why this kind of approach might be difficult or sort of limited in its use when it comes to studying literature, particularly literature of the early 20th century? Anyone?
Because of the stream of consciousness method used.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Not just stream of consciousness, but more broadly, the importance laid on interiority, even
Yeah,
if the
characters interiority.
even if it isn't exactly a stream of consciousness method, a lot of modernist authors would turn inwards, would focus on the inner happenings of the mind, and very often there wouldn't be much of a plot. All right, in Ulysses, I mean, okay, there is some things do happen, but really much of what's happening is internal, and plot is not crucial to many stories. Okay, so again, perhaps limited applicability. Okay, I'm going to go back to muting you. If you have any questions, you can interrupt me by unmuting yourself. Screen share, current slide, resume. Okay, so function then is essentially an act of a character that helps the story along. And according to Propp, there are 31 possible functions, all or some of which may appear, but there is the order in which, so he lists them, and I'll show you the 31 functions. In case, by the way, don't be worried, I'm not going to expect you to memorize them, all right? I won't ask you a question in which you have to list all 31 functions. You just have to get a general sense of it, and we'll be talking more about how we can use it to read text, so you don't have to memorize them. But he lists these 31 functions, and not all of the functions have to appear in a particular tale. Sometimes only a few of them will appear, but the order in which they appear is important, and the order is preserved according to Propp. Okay, and these functions are stable and independent of the particular character who fulfills them. Okay. Now, aside from the functions, there are also the actors or the spheres of action. So let's look at that now. You can see over here, you have the 7 spheres of action. So apart from the functions, there are the actors or spheres of action. The dramatis personae of the folktale consists of 7 different character types. So you have the villain, you have the donor or provider, you have a helper, you have the princess, a kind of sought for person, some kind of goal of a quest. You have a dispatcher, you have the hero, and you have a false hero. Okay, this limited number of characters and narrative situations nevertheless permits an almost infinite number of story possibilities. Okay, now we'll come back to that, but just one moment. I have realized that I haven't brought my, I'm quite thirsty and I need to go and get some water. So if you'll please excuse me for just a minute, I'll just go and get some water. Theek ache? If you don't mind, okay, just give me a minute. Okay, where were we? Right. So we were talking about these spheres of action. So these are the spheres of action, and there are 7 in number, and they're listed here for you. And this limited number provides, nonetheless, for quite an unlimited number of possibilities. In fact, if you're interested, By the way, can you see my screen? Have I put the screen share on? Sorry, I'm still getting used to the software. Don't know. Okay, yeah, there we go. Can you see the PPT?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so let me give you an example of a function of one of these spheres of action. So let's look at the helper. Let me give you an idea of how this works. One of the actors that Propp identifies, and again, there's a lot of noise, so I'm going to have to mute you guys. Sorry about this.
Helper.
Yes, helper. But before that, I'm going to have to mute you guys because there's too much noise. Mute all. Okay. Screen share and yeah. Okay. Okay. So let me give you an idea of how this works. So one of the actors that Propp identifies and which he sees returning in all the tales is the helper. Okay. Now, all that this particular character type or the sphere of action has to do is to offer an act of help that keeps the story moving. Okay. So the helper could be male or female. So there can be sort of manifest differences, surface level differences. So the helper can be male or female, can be a forester. So for instance, in Little Red Riding Hood, you have a forester giving aid, or it could be a hunter. For instance, in Snow White, you have a hunter giving aid. Could be someone old or could be someone young. For instance, and I'll be returning to The Hobbit because it's a story I hope any of you somewhat know, and it's a story that I'm very familiar with. And when I teach it, I often use a kind of structuralist approach. But in The Hobbit, of course, it's Gandalf who comes and offers aid at many points in the story. So it could be old or young, rich or poor. The possibilities are infinite. And in one of his examples, Propp illustrates the act of helping with examples from 4 fairy tales. In the first one, the hero is given an eagle, and this eagle carries him to another kingdom. So kind of eagle comes and gives him aid. In the second one, the hero is given a horse, and that horse gets him to wherever he needs to go. In the third tale, he's presented with a boat. And in the fourth one, he's given a ring that magically produces a number of young men who carry him wherever he wants to go. Wonderful little device. You wear this ring and a team of young men arrives who can carry you wherever you want to go. Quite strange vehicle of transport. But anyway, so these are some examples then of how you can have at the surface level many kinds of differences, but the function remains the same, okay? So the people who help the hero are different. The hero himself has different names, and the means of conveyance, you can call it an eagle or it could be a horse, are different, okay? But the actor and the function or the event, the plot event is the same in each case. So what you get then is repetition and uniformity underlying surface profusion of detail. So despite the surface profusion of detail, the number of functions is extremely small, namely 31, and the number of spheres of action is also small, okay? So Levi-Strauss notes that, so Propp notes rather that there is a kind of twofold quality of the tale. It has, on the one hand, an amazing multiformity, a picturesqueness and color. So the surface differences are great. And on the other hand, it is no less strikingly uniform, okay? You can see that underlying all of this surface profusion of detail, you can detect some uniformity, okay? So that is your basic gist of what's going on here. I'll move on to list the 31 functions. Again, you don't have to know these by heart. I'm just going to read this list out here. What I want you to do is, while I'm reading them out, I want you to think of some stories that you know well, particularly say mythology. Some of you are studying mythology, so it could be any kind of adventure story or myth or fairy tale or folk tale, and try to see whether this framework that Propp presents us with has any kind of universal applicability, okay? So here are the 31 functions. One of the members of a family absents himself from a home. An interdiction, that is a prohibition, is addressed to the hero. So you will not do this or you will not do that. The interdiction is violated. The villain, number 4, makes an attempt at reconnaissance. The villain receives information about his victim. The villain attempts to deceive his victim in order to take possession of him or his belongings. The victim submits to deception and thereby unwittingly helps his enemy. Hold on a second here, Mark. Can I please have taking a class? No, I'm sorry. No, you're not. Oof, hold on, please. I'm really sorry about this. I'm taking a class. Could you please? I'm so sorry about this, folks. My mother has invaded the pitch. We're not going anywhere. And it's threatening to go for a walk because the weather is nice. But you're not going anywhere, Mark. Apologies, folks. This is the nature of online classes. There's a lot of pitch invasions happening from time to time. Anyway, I'm going back to sharing the screen. Okay, so the villain receives information about his victim. The villain attempts to deceive his victim in order to take possession of him or his belongings. The victim submits to deception and thereby unwittingly helps his enemy. The villain causes harm or injury to a member of a family. One member of a family either lacks something or desires to have something. Misfortune or lack is made known. The hero is approached with a request or a command. He is allowed to go or he is dispatched. The seeker, that is the hero in quester mode, agrees or decides upon counteraction. So this is the first stage of the story. And I'm going to pause it here to just have a chat. Unmute Korbo. Acha, unmute Kollam. Now, let's just look at a couple of stories. There's a lot of noise happening. What is that noise? একটুখানি একটু দেখো তো তোমাদের খুব ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড আওয়াজ খুব বেশি আছে। Okay, question. How many of you have watched or read? Because I usually... Now someone's phone is ringing.
What is going on?
I don't know what's going on.
No, sorry, sir. I've put it on.
Yeah, okay. So basically I was going to ask how many of you are even sort of vaguely aware of the story of Lord of the Rings, because I often use that story to sort of compare with Propp's functions, because I do find...
I am.
So, okay, if even 3 or 4 of you are, and I'll tell you the story as we go on, you'll see how there are remarkable similarities here. So basically, Lord of the Rings is that the story begins, actually there's a prequel. For those of you who don't know, it's The Hobbit is the first part of the Lord of the Rings. And basically you have this race of kind of diminutive short little creatures called hobbits, and they lead a kind of sheltered existence. I have to mute you again, guys. Sorry, this is just too much noise.
Hobbits.
Yeah. So, and this is a world in which there are various races. There are men, there are elves, and there are hobbits, and various other creatures. There are these other races such as orcs as well. And basically you have this Dark Lord figure, typical Dark Lord figure threatening the world. And the backstory is that the Dark Lord had made certain rings of power, and they had been distributed to various important kings and rulers across the world. And he had secretly made it such that he would wear the master ring, which would control all the other rings, and thereby he would gain control of the whole world. And by a kind of a very long and complicated set of events, he is defeated, he loses the ring, and the ring disappears. It gets lost, and it is eventually found by a hobbit, by one of these little diminutive creatures. And basically the story begins in a situation where you have the focus is on a young hobbit called Frodo Baggins, who is the current owner of the ring. And essentially this wizard figure, the Senex figure, again a very typical archetypal figure, comes and tells him that the Dark Lord is rising again and he is looking for his ring of power and you need to destroy that ring. So that's how the quest begins. And I'll screen share again just to show you that there are remarkable similarities there. It won't be perfect, but there is quite a noticeable overlap. Wait, I need to unmute you for this section. Okay, so this unmute thing is just not working. Mute all. Okay, sorry about this, folks, but there's so many technological problems. Okay, so one of the members of a family absents himself from home. This happens, Srilekha, you know the story of Lord of the Rings. Let me unmute. Let me see if I can unmute individuals. That might be. Srilekha, toke unmute kollam. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you've read Lord of the Rings?
Yes.
Is there a member of a family who absents himself from home?
ফ্রোডো তো নিজেই অ্যাবসেন্ট, ও তো নিজেই
সেটা
কোয়েস্টে
পরে হয়,
বেরোচ্ছে,
কিন্তু তার আগে
মনে পড়ছে না।
Bilbo, do you remember? Bilbo has the
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
party.
হ্যাঁ 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 হ্যাঁ, ও হ্যাঁ, রাইট।
In fact, that's how the story begins.
হ্যাঁ, বার্থডে পার্টিটার থেকে।
Birthday party, he leaves.
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ।
Okay, is there a prohibition addressed to the hero? Well, yes, not to use the ring. Gandalf comes and says, don't use the ring. Does he violate it? Okay, not so much. I don't think he uses the ring that much.
But he's tempted.
He is tempted. The villain makes an attempt at reconnaissance. Absolutely. Pratham dike ki hoy? The Dark Riders come, right? The Dark Riders, who are the servants of Sauron, are sent to find out about, they have heard about the Shire, they've heard that the ring might be in keeping of a hobbit. So they are sent to do reconnaissance. Tarpore, the villain receives information about his victim. Yes, the villain, Sauron, learns that there is a Bilbo Baggins who has the ring.
Follows up with him.
Follows up. Tarpore, the villain attempts to deceive his victim in order to take possession of him or his belongings. Yes, এটা exactly বোধহয় হয় না. But there are various characters in Bree, one of the towns in which they stay, who are servants of the Lord, who seem to be friendly but are in fact serving the Dark Lord. The victim submits to deception and thereby unwittingly helps his enemy. Not exactly.
But sir, এটা তো ওই টেম্পটেশনের পার্টটার থেকে হচ্ছে না, because he is tempted that at a certain point this leads to him helping his enemy.
Yeah, because he uses the ring and then the servants of the Dark Lord are drawn towards him. That does happen. The villain causes harm or injury to a member of the family, or one member of the family lacks something or desires to have something. Harm or injury to Hoy Prochur, they get attacked early on top of the Barrow Downs. Even in Bree, there's an attempt to kill them. Misfortune or lack is made known. The hero is approached with a request or command. He is allowed to go or he's dispatched. Yes, he's sent off on the quest. He said, go and destroy the ring. The seeker, that is the hero in quester mode, agrees or decides upon counteraction, which is exactly what happens. He decides to go on the quest to destroy the ring.
Destroy the ring.
So you can see how just one story, but it's a story that draws on a lot of myths. It's a story that draws on medieval period romances, and it seems to show quite a remarkable degree of overlap with this particular pattern with that Propp draws out. ঠিক আছে? আচ্ছা, আবার সবাইকে মিউট করছি to continue with the second set of functions. So let's see what happens next. The hero leaves home. The hero is tested, interrogated, attacked, etc., which prepares the way for his receiving either a magical agent or helper. The hero reacts to the actions of the future donor. The hero acquires the use of a magical agent, that is an object, an animal, etc. The hero is transferred, delivered, or led to the whereabouts of an object of search. The hero and the villain join in direct combat. The hero is branded. The villain is defeated. The initial misfortune or lack is liquidated. The hero returns. The hero is pursued on his return journey. Again, I will unmute some of you, let me see if anyone wants to join in. I'll unmute all of you. But let's have a few of you contributing to this conversation with narratives that you know of. Can you think of stories that follow this pattern? I was thinking Harry Potter is something maybe even
Yeah.
more of us
Yes,
have
Yes,
read.
yes, yes. I was just
Yeah.
about to make this point. Harry Potter.
Harry Potter মোটামুটি
Harry-
এরকম হয়,
Me
hero
too.
leaves
Huh.
home,
That's the
hero is minimize করলাম. Hero is interrogated or attacked, prepares. He receives magical aid. Harry Potter magical aid প্রচুর হয়. Hagrid comes and helps him out.
yes.
He acquires the use of a magical agent, the wand. He receives the wand. Hero is transferred, delivered, or led to the whereabouts of an object of search. In the first book, it would be the Philosopher's Stone, which he eventually acquires. The hero and the villain join in direct combat. At the end of each of the books, there is some kind of confrontation between Harry and Voldemort. The hero is branded. এটা তো একেবারে প্রথমেই হয়, but increasingly as the stories progress, he is more and more branded in the sense that the Dark Lord, his scar will often hurt, and there is a kind of a branding almost in the literal sense. কারণ ওখানটা it burns. The villain is defeated. At the end of each of the stories, there's some kind of a setback which the Dark Lord suffers. And finally, the initial misfortune or lack, the situation of threat is liquidated, and the hero returns. So can you see any parallels then? Anyone else? Any other stories?
We have Oedipus Rex, but then it's a play.
Sure, but why not? You can think of plays as well. Oedipus also, yes, the hero leaves home. The hero is, does he receive any kind of help or aid?
Kind of aid, but it's not magical. In the
Yeah,
form of a prophecy, but which ultimately goes against him.
that's true. See, Oedipus might be a slightly different case. You know why? Because it's a tragedy. Now,
Oh yes.
one of the things that Propp says is that this is a pattern for fairy tales. Folk tales and fairy tales, you'll see in the next section. In fact, let's move on and I'll show you. They almost always look at 30 and 31. It almost always ends with the defeat of the hero and the defeat of the villain and the marriage and the success of the hero. So we're not looking at the tragic pattern here. We are more sort of looking at the comic pattern. And here I don't use it in the kind of limited sense, but in the broader sense of how a tragedy is usually a kind of movement from disorder or order to disorder, and comedy from disorder to order. Too much noise. Why is this happening? এটা আমার অন্য ক্লাসে হয় না। কোনো একটা one of two of you are, there's something is happening. Have to mute you again. I'm so sorry. This is not ideal, but বড্ড আওয়াজ হচ্ছিল, ঠিক আছে? Unmute yourself if you have any contribution to make. So let's look at the third section, rescue of the hero from pursuit. This is after the hero has begun to return home. The hero unrecognized arrives home or in another country. Now here I will unmute you because this is kind of eerily reminiscent of one particular story I can think of. Sorry for this constant muting, unmuting, but does this number 23 remind you of something? The hero
Sir, could you
unrecognized.
screen? Sir, could you please screen share?
Screen share করিনি, screen share করিনি. Oh, sorry.
Nah.
Yeah, screen share. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna try and see if I figure out কাকে mute করলে এই আওয়াজগুলো চলে যাচ্ছে। ঠিক আছে, I'm muting you one by one to see. No, this noise is still coming. Okay, I think that solved it. I think Genia, it is coming from yours. ঠিক আছে? I'm sorry for this, but let me unmute the rest of you for a minute. Shanghamitra toke unmute করলাম, still no noise. Shorab toke unmute করলাম, still no noise. Paloma unmuted you, no noise. Manashi unmuted you, no noise. Rupsha unmuting you, no noise. Ritik unmuting you, no noise. Srilekha, you're okay. Father Fernandez unmuting you, no noise. Okay, so Genia, it is from your end. I hope you don't mind. So if you want to contribute, Genia, you can unmute yourself. But where was I? So one, this number 23 reminds me of a particular story, very, very famous story. Can anyone tell me? Which one?
Mm,
The hero, unrecognized, arrives home or in another country.
Rip Van Winkle.
Sorry?
Can you hear me? Rip Van Winkle.
Van Winkle.
Rip Van Winkle.
Rip Van Winkle.
Rip Van
Rip
Winkle.
Van
Okay, I don't
Winkle.
know. I don't know the story of Rip Van Winkle, but what are the key ball?
But the hero, Rip Van Winkle, is hello, can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Yes, the hero falls asleep for 30 years, if I'm not wrong.
Okay.
And then he arrives home, his country, his village, and he is getting unrecognized by the villagers as Rip Van Winkle.
Right. So this pattern of recognition, I was actually thinking of a much more famous story. I'll give you a hint. Homer.
Oh yeah.
Oh.
Yes.
Which one? Which one?
Odysseus.
Yes,
Odysseus.
Odysseus, yes.
Antrim.
Exactly. Odysseus returns home unrecognized. He's, he's eventually recognized by
Odysseus.
stringing that bow. So anyway, so there are patterns, that this pattern can be applied to many stories, but perhaps not perfectly. A false hero presents unfounded claims. A difficult task is proposed to the hero. The task is resolved. The hero is recognized. False hero or villain is exposed. This happens in Odysseus in a lot of ways.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes, as a
Mighty
matter
God.
of fact,
Yeah,
sir, I think Game of Thrones to a certain extent follows this pattern,
Does it?
even not as linearly. It's much more complex, but shades of this can be found there too.
Certainly, okay. All right, I would be surprised, in fact, if you could think that through and maybe tell us later in detail, Karun. The interesting thing about Game of Thrones is that it really tries to, in terms of its plot, to be unpredictable. But if you can see an underlying pattern, that would be very interesting indeed. Abar eto awaz hocche. Oh, Genia, you have unmuted yourself. That's why. Sorry.
Can I be heard?
Yes, Ritik, you can be heard. Okay. So anyway, so this is what happens. The false hero is exposed even in Ulysses, even in the story of Odysseus. This does happen. Various false claims to the queen's hand are defeated. Abar, Genia, have you? Yes, you have unmuted yourself. Sorry, this is terrible. I have to keep going and muting Genia. Anyway, so the villain is punished and the hero is married and a census throne. So essentially a kind of comic pattern. So Itai, I'll leave it here. What I'll give you kind of not an assignment as such, but I encourage you ahead of the next class, if you can, I'll send you the PPT. Ita ekটু dekhe to see if you can find stories that quite strongly adhere to this particular pattern. Okay. Now, I'll move on to discuss some of the problems with Propp's view, particularly when it comes to literary studies. And here I'm drawing quite heavily from Janet Lesinski's book, Applications of Vladimir Propp's Formalist Paradigm. So one of the first things that we can say is that there is a kind of reductive process at work here, because binary opposites in the morphology are clearly defined in relation to protagonist and antagonist. So one of the accusations one might, or one of the things that you can level against Propp is a kind of simplistic reduction of the characters into protagonist and antagonist. Now, very often the stories that we read, particularly because we, the canonical works in English literature, particularly novels, will not be works that are morally simple, all right, that are simplistic in this way where we can reduce the characters into protagonists and antagonists. And therefore, using this kind of a framework might be quite ill-suited to literary studies and might be quite reductive. So the binaries intrinsic to the morphology are inclined, and some might argue intend, to polarize the audience into adopting clear value judgments. So not only does it reduce the characters into protagonists and antagonists, it encourages value judgment by sort of demonizing the villain, who in fact might be a slightly more complex character. It encourages the audience to adopt an attitude of value judgment regarding every action depicted or described within a tale. So number one, at the level, Any questions? Anything? Ritik, did you have something to say? Or are you getting a pitch invasion as well? Someone?
Yeah,
In this?
বলছে সব শোনা যাচ্ছে।
Okay. Anyway, so incidentally, Ritik, you try and get some sunlight, my dear lad. হ্যাঁ, খুব অন্ধকারে তুমি একটা ডার্ক লর্ডের মতো বসে আছো। হ্যাঁ, it's probably we're not getting enough sunshine, and I don't know about the rest of you, but my sleep cycle is suffering a lot. অদ্ভুত সময় ঘুমোতে যাচ্ছি, অদ্ভুত সময় উঠছি।
ভীষণ ভাবে।
Anyway, সবারই অসুবিধা হচ্ছে। Anyway, আরো 1 মাস মতো তো চলবে at least, যা বুঝতে পারছি। Okay, let's move on. So, binary opposites value judgments, a scientific schema also that writes the reader out. Now, the problem with this kind of analysis, not just props, but any structuralist analysis, is that it proposes to be sort of scientific. And it proposes to, it's a kind of grand narrative foisted by the scholar, which reduces the importance of the reader's contribution in making meaning out of a text. So, diminution of the reader's importance in the process of interpretation. So, an interpretive framework like this would be very much the opposite of what, for instance, reader response theorists would be arguing for. Okay, so Roland Barthes would not like this kind of framework. Stanley Fish would not like this kind of framework because it's a kind of hegemony of the scholar. The scholar is telling you exactly how to interpret the text. The scholar is moreover suggesting that this particular framework is objective and universally valid. Therefore, it writes the reader out of the entire process of contributing towards meaning. Okay, so Propp leaves the reader little opportunity. Sorry, there's a typo here. I've missed the word little here. Propp leaves the reader little opportunity to consciously engage in decision making in the process of interpreting text. So naturally, the post-structuralists would dislike this. Propp's morphology, sorry, that's a reprint that Janet Lesensky has cited. Propp's morphology as an example of structuralist thought systematically built on binarism is subject to critique by Derrida. Derrida, in his Off Grammatology, raises issues with this kind of binaristic thought. Derrida, who prefers a deconstruction of rigid oppositions such as nature, culture, other, and self. Likewise, feminist critics quite rightly would have an issue with the simplistic framework offered by Propp. So Laura Mulvey in Visual Pleasure Narrative Cinema, Laura Mulvey, incidentally, who has some very famous essay. Does anyone know Laura Mulvey's most significant contribution? I'll put it up. I think I'll include her essay in the MA reading list soon, the one that I've made. Has anyone heard of Laura Mulvey's name? Have you heard of this? Yes, exactly. Male gaze, yeah. So she's a feminist theorist who theorizes the male gaze, particularly in cinema. So Uta, I think I'll give that essay for you to read. Anyway, so Laura Mulvey argues against the patriarchal positions that Propp's morphology can be taken to imply. For example, Propp's morphology accommodates representations of women in terms of stereotypes such as victim, requiring rescue, or bride. In fact, if you go back and see, it's very clearly gendered right here, these spheres of action. Princess. A sought for person is a princess. Why can't it be a prince? Okay. Perhaps one would say that in his data set, in the data set that he is analyzing, it does tend to be a princess. Okay. But
sir,
yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so the recent retellings of Mahabharata and Ramayana that I'm going through very often destabilizes such a structuralist reading, right? It often takes out characters who have been sidelined throughout the major texts.
Absolutely.
And they are in the front light now, like Mandodari and everyone else. Like,
in fact, I mean, yeah, I'm supervising 2 students who I'll encourage them to talk to you. See, actually, I bolbo about research culture. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I'll go into that in a moment. But আমার দুজন MA student এই বছরে are working on precisely these texts. One of them is looking at author called Anand Neelkanthan. He has looked at Duryodhan. Ravan and Duryodhan. And he's sort of retold the mythology from their perspective. Arekjon is working on a story in which Shurpanakha is the protagonist, basically. So you're quite right. Recent retellings of the myths are trying to destabilize this entire framework and give us modern versions of these, trying to tell the subaltern tales, and we can look at that. But to take a minor sort of detour here, I want to encourage, and let's talk about this. Is not pertinent to Propp in any way, but so একটু stop share করলাম, what can we do to kind of build a research culture? I don't know তোদের সাথে লিংকটা শেয়ার করেছিলাম কিনা, but I recently organized meetings, Zoom meetings with some of my friends in Oxford and Trinity. My friend Bhagya was in Oxford, and my friend Kabir, who is in Trinity, and we were talking about research cultures, and I encourage my MA students to kind of attend these Zoom chats. But আমি একটা জিনিস যেটা বুঝেছি, and here I'm going to sort of really put the emphasis on your actions, is that what is sorely lacking in the Indian university system at the higher studies level, and what we, at least I am very desperate to change. I will absolutely do my very level best to inculcate the best practices that I found in the West and bring them to our university, যেটা পাবলিক ইউনিভার্সিটিতে হতো না। তোরা প্রাইভেট ইউনিভার্সিটিতে কাজ করছিস, এখানে করা যায়, কারণ এখানে we have a lot more autonomy. But একটা রিসার্চ কালচার আমাদের সেট আপ করতে হবে, and the onus is on you. So to give you an example, আমাদের কুইন্সে যেটা হতো is there used to be a monthly research seminar. This means that all the students would get together, all the current research students would get together in a room. Any two of them would volunteer to speak for 15 minutes on what work they have done in the last 1 month or 1.5 months or whatever it is. So that ensures a number of things. One, you don't feel isolated. One of the biggest problems with PhD study is that there is a tendency, because you're reading your own text, you're reading in your niche area, কোনো অতটা ক্লাস করতে হয় না, attendance issue generally নেই, তো লোকেরা খুব alienated হয়ে যায়। তো this kind of practice ensures that this doesn't happen. Number two, it ensures a certain amount of accountability. I can guarantee you that once the research process begins properly, I will ensure that my students meet me at least once a month, maybe twice a month. So, and every month you have to send me some write-up, okay? So I will keep you on your toes, but the building of a research culture is partly dependent on you. We shall be trying to organize seminars and conferences, but what I'm going to do once your second year starts is I'm going to make sure that at least once a year, you students get together and organize a conference. এটার জন্য funding কি করে পাবো? We will talk, we'll have a discussion, but all of you are going to work together and put together a postgraduate conference at our university, okay? We're going to build a research culture. We're going to have research seminars. We're going to meet once a month. We're going to present. We are going to encourage you to go to other conferences, of course, but we will have our own conferences, and we need to work together to build a research culture. Okay, so can I get some commitment from you guys towards that? Yeah, all right.
Yes, sir.
Research seminar to definitely korbo. So every month you will meet, you'll have a chat, regular progress updates. Okay, so now let's go back to our discussion. Screen share. Okay. So I'll just try and wrap this up because it's been a long class already. So feminist criticism has its issues with reducing complex female characters to stereotypes such as victim or bride. Now, one kind of counter argument could be that, Propp is working with a very limited data set, and in this data set, perhaps the women characters are framed in terms of simple stereotypes such as victim or bride. Okay. Because to what extent do we see, are the interiorities of these characters explored in these stories? Are their personalities explored? In Rapunzel, do you get to see Rapunzel in great detail, or is she merely presented as some kind of stereotype? So Sheila, that could be a kind of counter argument, right? So it depends on, because also you have to realize that many of these stories, in whatever form you read them, are usually very pared down. It's plot driven. These are usually short. These are short, simple folk tales. Character interiority অতটা develop করার scope ই থাকে না, all right? So there might be a tendency to present characters as simplistic, okay? So that could be a counter argument. Finally, we can talk about some methodological issues. So David Bordwell, in this essay, a very clever title, Appropriations and Improprieties, Problems in the Morphology of Film Narrative. এরকম cheeky title দিলে I would be unhappy. But ektukhani you can, you have to draw a line between being too cheeky and being kind of interesting. Because it's catchy, and drawing eyeballs is part of what your title should be doing. Anyway, so David Bordwell is critical of the sample on which Propp drew for his observations. Bordwell points out that Propp neglected religious tales, romantic tales, ballads, fables, cumulative tales, and other varieties of folk narratives. thereby undermining possible claims of the universality of the study. So Propp, according to Bordwell, drew on only 87 of the 100 samples provided by his primary source. So not only, not only do we, oh, hang on, I need to, excuse me for a second, I just need to close my WhatsApp. My group of school friends has decided to make an appearance. Am I sharing screen? Yeah. So where was I? Okay, so neglected religious. So not only does he not look at the entire wealth of the Russian folk tradition, including he neglects religious tales, he neglects romantic tales, he neglects ballads, fables, other kinds of tales. But not only that, in the selection, in the 100 samples provided by his main primary source, which is Afanasyev's Nardoin Rusky Skazki collection. This is the this is the collection that he draws on mainly. There are 100 stories, but he cherry picks only 87 in order to fit his narrative. And this is something that you must be careful of. This is, you know, it's a research methodology discussion. Those of you who are you know, I don't think too many of you will be making a kind of universalizing claim to the extent that Propp does. We are living in the post-structural you know, in department or in the post-structural academy, and it's perfectly fine just to ultimately say that this is complicated, situation is complicated. It's as valid to complicate grand narratives as it is to foist your own. So I, for instance, in my PhD thesis was attempting to unravel a grand narrative. I was working against Said and trying to suggest that although British colonial and missionary texts in the 18th and 19th century, you know, they're basically much more complicated. Although they do support imperialism, although they ultimately become texts that can be used in order to further imperialism, they are not doing so on the basis of a simplistic rejection of the Oriental. So I was both complicating and sort of supporting the grand narrative in some ways. So Tumadir Atuta, I don't think you will go for an approach like Propp, trying to say scientifically there are these 31 functions under the text that I read. But nonetheless, one thing you have to avoid doing is cherry picking. Cherry picking mane je atuta sample set amar, kintu ami khali duto nilam, and then I say that this is universal. So if you're going to make a universalizing claim, then you better make sure that your data set is really broad. You understand what I'm saying? Otherwise, its universality is undermined. Okay. On the other hand, you can go for a close reading approach, which I did in my thesis, where I'm not trying to foist a grand narrative. So in that case, I can justify looking at a few texts closely. I'm trying to untangle these texts. I'm trying to complicate them. I'm trying to develop certain nuances. I'm not going for a single grand narrative. But if you are foisting a very big point, some kind of universalizing claim, then you have to make sure your data set is equally comprehensive. Okay. Okay. Now moving on. So that's Propp in a nutshell. I'm not giving you the primary text, incidentally. Baki shopkota jonne tomader primary text porata dorkar. Etate it's you know, it's not that essential. If you get the basic gist of it, again, you don't have to memorize these 31 functions. You just have to have a general sense of it and think more about application. Okay. Actor Jinish, I'd like to show you now. Last thing we'll discuss today is how this has been developed further. So I'll just show you one other thinker. There's Joseph Campbell, who's written a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, which is a similar, he makes a similar structure, and he says that this can be applied to most mythic narratives, which is a basic there and back again journey. He calls it the hero's journey. If you look at the diagram to the left, it begins with a call to adventure. A helper comes along. The helper encourages the hero to leave his space, leave his home, and there is a crossing of a threshold. There are various battles with dragon-like figures. There are various trials that the hero goes through. Ekhane clearly dekhayni, but on the left side, but the hero eventually will face some kind of subterranean journey. Okay, and will emerge from that, in a sense, reborn.
Sir?
Yeah, go ahead, Surekha, bol.
So বলছে যে if when we are talking about such structuring of texts and these authors like Campbell or Propp, they are only taking into consideration folk tales or mythic tales, right? So should we take this structure and implement it on other literary texts which really deal with realism or realistic depiction of life? Can we
That's
or
an
should
interesting
we?
question. So that's precisely the question I'm raising. To what extent, Mani, to what extent is this applicable to literary texts? That is something for you to figure out, because you see, you can apply them in some cases. Horo ami Hobbit ta porai, it's remarkable how much Hobbit fits with this structure. So I'll just show you. Dandikir, if you can see this, the hero's journey, huh? Ordinary world, call to adventure. So I actually, when I teach the Hobbit, I refer to one essay in which a scholar has shown that the Hobbit almost exactly fits this pattern. It
Acha.
begins in the Shire. There's an ordinary world. There's a call to adventure. Gandalf comes along and says, "Here are the dwarves." Okay, he refuses. You can see Dandiki refusal likha ache. He says, "Ami jabo na." Tapore, there's a crossing of the threshold, meeting with the mentor. Yes, he meets the dwarves. He meets Gandalf. Okay, and he crosses the threshold. There are tests. He faces the battle with the trolls. He approaches a cave. There's an inmost cave. He goes underground into the misty mountains. He faces an ordeal, and he comes out of the misty mountains. Okay, reward hoy. Exactly at that point, he gets the magic ring. Okay, then there's another a set of ordeals that he goes through, and then eventually there's a road back. There's a return with the elixir, so he returns with various kinds of gifts. Okay, so অনেক
But
কিছুই
sir,
হয় হ্যাঁ বল
স্যার এই টেলগুলো যেমনি হবিট বা লর্ড অফ দ্য রিংস বা মহাভারত এগুলো আমরা তো সবকটাই ফোক টেল বা ফ্যান্টাসি ফিকশনের মধ্যে দেখছি এবার if we take a tale like say Moll Flanders or anything like that, like anything from Dickens, so we cannot naturally implement the structure there, right?
সেটা তোমায় দেখতে হবে. So that's an interesting question. To what extent does this pattern, which typifies, which is quite applicable, you might say, to mythic stories, to what extent does that fit with the realist stories is a question to be explored. You have to think it through. Moll Flanders, see, the problem with something like Moll Flanders is that it's very episodic, and let's see, Moll Flanders, she begins off poor. She অনেকদিন আগে পড়েছি. Then she lives with this particular family, I believe. Who has read Moll Flanders recently, বলতো?
Not recently.
না
আগে পড়েছি।
এম এর ফার্স্ট ইয়ারে পড়েছিলাম।
I have actually read it. I was teaching it to my Queen's students, so I should remember it better. But Moll, I don't think she has this kind of there and back again pattern. She does. It's a comic narrative in the sense that she does end up succeeding. She's, she's sent to Newgate prison, and she's not in fact killed, but she's transported, and she eventually becomes successful in America, etc. So এটা
But then again,
হ্যাঁ বল
but then again ওই যে ভিলেন তারপরে প্রিন্সেস এগুলো ভাবে তো ভাগ করতে পারবো না না মল ফ্ল্যান্ডার্স কে
ঠিক. So it will exactly. So the main point that I think that your question raises is that the complexity of these narratives, it's difficult to identify a single villain in Moll Flanders. There are various of these figures of the seducer. So whoever, I think it's Mr. B or that no, I'm thinking of Pamela and Clarissa, but Moll Flanders, Moll is more like the seducer. Every few pages she finds a new gentleman to have a romp with. Good for her. But basically এটাই হচ্ছে problem যে in most of the kind of novels that we read, I think the characters are far too complex to kind of reduce to these simplistic terms of hero, villain, helper, etc. But এটা করে
even if you look at something like Joseph Andrews, it kind of loosely fits into the pattern. Not typically fits into the pattern, but very loosely it does fit into the pattern. And if we exclude all fantasy and the myths from it, kind of loosely fits into the pattern.
I would say that any kind of adventure narrative would be one in which, or if you look at, I think someone like Robert Louis Stevenson would be very interesting to compare with this. At the adventure, very often you will find this basic situation of a hero who begins off in a safe space, then something comes to someone comes or something happens to disrupt that. Then there is a journey. Often there's some kind of climactic event which transforms him or her. There is some kind of a big battle, and there's a return to the safe space. So it at the adventure narrative way, it's I think quite often applicable. But in something like the picturesque, I think, bol.
বলছি ম্যাজিক রিয়ালিজমে এই প্লটটা কিছুটা ফলো করা হচ্ছে না, যেরকম মিডনাইট চিলড্রেন।
Who's speaking, by the way? I mean, I can't.
I'm Paloma.
হ্যাঁ, Paloma, দাঁড়া, তুই খুঁজে পাই। হ্যাঁ, Paloma, বল।
হ্যাঁ, বলছি যে এটা এই স্টোরি লাইনটা জেনারেলি ম্যাজিক রিয়ালিজমে, স্পেশালি উইথ স্টোরিজ লাইক মিডনাইট চিলড্রেন, এখানে কিছুটা ফলো করা হচ্ছে না।
বল, মিডনাইট চিলড্রেনে কি হয়? অনেকটা তুই বল।
There's first of all, the Salim Sinai, they are gifted with certain powers.
And yeah, they can they are born at the strike of midnight on. They have the connection. They all have that connection with each other, right?
All have that connection, and they try to achieve something greater. And there's not a princess, but then there's a quest for a girl. So it loosely kind of fits into this storyline.
You know, I would say so. Not only in myths, but একটা গল্প হতে গেলে না, there has to be arguably complication and denouement. There has to be something that is aspired towards, or some kind of tension, একটা conflict বা tension বা some kind of lack or some kind of quest ছাড়া একটা গল্প বানানো is difficult. বুঝতে পারছিস তো? মানে একটা at a very limited level, this kind of framework would be quite broadly applicable. মানে exact 31 functions হয়তো হবে না, but একটা quest structure in a narrative in general, you will very often find a quest structure, or you will at the very least find some kind of complication followed by denouement, some kind of conflict between a protagonist and an antagonist, or some kind of opposing force. ঠিক আছে? এগুলো ছাড়া একটা গল্প লেখাই বেশ difficult.
And why this opposing force needs to be the embodiment of some other person. I mean the protagonist and antagonist can be present within the same character sometimes.
That's very interesting. Yes, and that's why I was talking about early 20th century fiction as a kind of counter example to this kind. So if you have a narrative that dwells on that is more about interiority, that is more about the mental space of the protagonist, then this kind of narrative, I suppose, would be less applicable in the literal sense. Okay, but that's a very interesting point. Okay, if any, ball.
Sir, Shongomitra. Sir, I was thinking about Narnia, but sir, it's very difficult to place who becomes the hero in that story, whether it's Peter or
it's the children, though. The entire group.
Yeah, the entire group becomes that, not just one journey rather.
That's true. That's another complication. Yeah.
So in Alice in Wonderland, can we not simply follow the steps and replace the position of the hero with the heroine? I mean, there are not.
By the way, it's through the looking glass, but yeah. Alison, well, no, the basic point is that what are you trying to say?
আমি বলছি যে ওখানে all these things, all these features of Propp, they visualize the hero as the protagonist, while in Alice's Wonderland, there is not much place for a hero, but it's the female leads who.
Sure, I mean, so that this doesn't disprove Propp, because Propp very clearly says that the hero can be male or female. So at the surface level, there can be any kind of difference, but the hero is basically the protagonist, the one who faces the challenge, or the one who is going on the quest. So সেখানে অনেক details might differ. So the name, the gender, whatever can differ. So that's not exactly
okay.
Okay, now Shon, এটা upload করতে হবে, and it's becoming very long. Fileটা খুব বড় হয়ে যায়. So I'll stop there for today. If anyone has any quick questions, you can go ahead. Otherwise, we're more or less done for today. Okay? Anyone? Any questions?
Okay.
ঠিক আছে তো yeah, go ahead, Ritik. Were you saying something?
When is our test? When is our exam?
Oh, your exam. Well, that will depend on the fate of the.